Chaldean Jewry. The first two groups, the Bnei Israel and the Cochin Jewry, they are the two ancient groups who have been in India for over 2,000 years. I believe the older of the two is the Cochin Jewry, who trace their ancestry from the time that the ships of King Solomon traded with India, some 3,000 years ago. But they had an accretion throughout the centuries, and the last accretion which took place was about 1,000 years ago. And that accretion consisted of Jews who were very fair, and they were called the white Jews. But locally they were referred to as the foreign Jews, and are still referred to as that. The Bnei Israel history, according to tradition, dates back to the time of 175 BC, before the current era, about the same time that the happenings which took place in Israel led to our observing the Hanukkah. One group apparently fled from the Galilee to Egypt, and from there, through the Red Sea, they went to India. They went by ship, and their ship was wrecked on the shores of India at Nagaon, and only 7 men and 7 women ultimately managed to get ashore. The local people looked after them very well. They permitted them to stay on the land. They tried to revive the dead, but they couldn't do that. And however, as it happened, they settled down there, became an agricultural community, and in course of time became also oil pressers. The local community used to call them Shenwar Telis, from the fact that Shenwar means Saturday, Teli means an oilman. Then on Saturday they rested from their work because they observed the Sabbath. Now that goes, as I said, goes back to about 2,000 years ago. The tradition then with the Bnei Israel is that having lost all their books in this shipwreck, they had forgotten almost everything about their religion except the principal word, the Shema Israel, which they always recited on every occasion, the birth, marriage, and death. Even the local people thought that these were perhaps a special caste of Brahmins who had come there, who had a special mantra of their own, the mantra being the Shema Israel. However, in course of time, they lived within the local community, but were very different from the rest of them, because the rest of the communities were Hindus, and there was a considerable difference in all their practices. One thing, of course, we are very happy about was that we could observe the kashrut, because the people with whom we lived were vegetarians, and so that preserved no problem. But we nevertheless carried on all the tenets of the Jewish religion, like the Brit Milah, which of course to us is a great mitzvah. To the Hindus it's an anathema. We bury our dead, and they cremate the dead. And so there were vast differences. Nevertheless, they were very tolerant people. They accepted us wholeheartedly, and allowed us to carry on our profession and our trade in the way we did. The Cochin Jews, if I may go back, they had, of course, a very illustrious history. Some of them were down south in Cochin, about 500 miles south from where the Bnei Israel were. They acquired from themselves, they became the ambassadors of the local kings, because the Hindus did not want to go overseas at the time. And it was only the Jews who used to do that. One of them, Joseph Rabban, acquired for himself a principality. He became like a local Raja in south, and in a city called Kranganore. The existence of this kingdom is well documented. This is one of those things where the grant of the kingship was given on copper plates, which are still extant, and they are available in the synagogue of the Cochin Jews in Cochin. The language is apparently has been fully deciphered, of course, but it has been dated variously between 300 of the current era to about 1200 of the current era. It is more possible that it was about 400 or 500 of the current era. So that was, in fact, the Jewish kingdom outside, one of the few Jewish kingdoms outside Israel, which lasted almost 1,000 years. And until 1485 was the date when Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope, and he came to India. And with him he brought the Roman Catholicism, and with him he also brought the Inquisition from Egypt and from Spain and Portugal. That was the time when the Portuguese and the Moors got together, and they destroyed the Jewish kingdom at Cranganore, and they had to flee. And they had to flee, and they fled, and they were received in open arms by the Maharaja of Cochin, who gave them shelter, contrary to the wishes of the Portuguese. He gave them a shelter not in a just as though he treated them right royally. He gave them a shelter next to his palace, in the most exclusive ground, and that was known as Jewtown. Anywhere else it would perhaps have acquired a pejorative significance, but not so in that area. And there he treated them so right royally. He treated them as though they still continued to be the kings of Cranganore, of Anjuvanam. He decided that that was one place where Jews would pay no tax. And it continued right until 1947, when India got its independence and all the Indian states had to amalgamate to the rest of India. That was the time when, of course, because of the change in the political situation, the Jews had to start paying taxes like everybody else did. Now, going back to the Bnei Israel, in the course of time, they found that it was not very easy for them to carry on, except that they said the Shema. But fortunately for them, about 800 to 900 years ago, they had a visitation from a David Rahabi, who immediately recognized these people as Jewish people from the way that they were practicing their religion, from the way that they were choosing their food, particularly by the way that the women folk would select the fish which was brought to them and chose the fish which was kosher from the fish which wasn't. Well, I think what really really struck this rabbi was also the fact that why else in the world would the people be saying Shema except if he was a Jew? And at that time it was known, in fact, there's a letter written by Moses Maimonides to the people in Ethiopia, in Yemen. They're saying that, look, far beyond you in India, there are Jewish people who do not have the Torah and yet follow its tenets. So the existence of the Bnei Israel was obviously known. He couldn't have been referring to the Cochin Jews because they were a learned people and always been so. Now, the existence of the Cochin Jews itself is documented in other ways. There is the Roman Catholic tradition that St. Thomas the disciple went to India. He went in the 1st century accompanied by a Jewish merchant. He went there. He happened to land in Cranganore on a certain day, and he had met a Jewish girl playing the flute. She took him to the Jewish center where he saw them celebrating a wedding. He sang Jewish songs and so on. That after he tried to convert them to what he thought was the new form of Judaism, the new faith, he got very few converts, and then he went on to more south to the Cape of Good Hope, practically to the uttermost Cape Comorin, and there apparently he was able to convert a number of Hindus who still conduct their prayers in Aramaic, which was the language of the time. They are the 1st century Christians. The relationship between those Christians and the Jews in Cochin was very close. There was never that enmity between them as that which existed in Europe between the Jew and the Christian. In fact, they were the ones where if the Jews buried the dead, and if there was somebody who was regarded as a very holy person, it was the Christians who would go take candles and burn candles at his grave. They made no objection. In fact, they came very openly and joined the Jews in during the Pesach ceremony, except, of course, if it happened to be on the Good Friday itself, when they would conduct their own services. But otherwise, they would be sitting with their Jewish friends, celebrating as the Seder and the Pesach. Now, if I may go back now to the Jews of India, as to what they did. I said to you that they were oil pressers. But apparently, being a farmer, there is some sort of association between being a farmer and a soldier, because all the soldiery generally comes from the agricultural classes. And we were no exception. In the course of time, they found that we made very good officers. And so the various the Rajas and Nawabs and so on, they used to select our people and for their armies. The Angres, for instance, which was the principal naval Maharashtrian power on the west coast of India, they had as their commodore a Navgaonkar from the Jewish community. And in course of time, of course, as I said, most of the kings had their thing. When the East India Company came to India, we were very fortunate that Catherine of Braganza, the Portuguese princess who went to marry King Charles, the Portugal handed over Bombay to the as a dowry to Catherine of Braganza, and King Charles promptly sold it for £5 to the East India Company. And it was when the British came to hold Bombay that they realized that going to Bombay would not be as perilous as it would have been had the Portuguese been there, because they realized that there were the people who would be very understanding about their religion. And so they went there. And the East India Company too found a very good use for the Jewish officers. The first, one of the earliest persons to be a commandant was Samuel de Baker, of whom one de Baker is Mr. Sam de Baker. Samuel Daniel is sitting here in the audience. He belongs to that. Now, the story goes that the East India Company used to wage war with Tipu Sultan of Mysore for the expansion of the British rule. And Tipu Sultan was a very orthodox, very fanatic Muslim. And he happened to be able to capture some of these people, of the British soldiers and the officers, including Samuel de Baker. Now, according to the Tipu Sultan, everyone who waged war against him, whether he was a subject or not, was guilty of high treason, and so could be condemned to death. But he might sometimes give them the option of converting to Islam. And so it was that they were all brought before him, and he began to ask each one his name. And as he came to Samuel de Baker, he said, "I am Samuel de Baker. I am a Bnei Israel." When he said that, Tipu Sultan's mother, the Begum Sahib, she was looking down from the balcony, and she called to Tipu and said, Tipu, he's a Bnei Israel. We have an injunction from our Prophet, a positive injunction, that we must honor these people, and he doesn't need to be converted. And so it was that he was saved. His life was saved. He was incarcerated, of course, for a little while. But in due course, with the assistance of the Cochin Jews, he got his liberty. And the Begum Sahib was so enamored of these people, and she liked them so much, she filled their baskets with gold and sent them with an escort back to the British lines. So when he went back, Samuel de Baker decided that for thanking the Lord for what he had done, he would build a synagogue. And so it was that he decided to have a synagogue in Bombay. The first Bnei Israel synagogue that was built there in 1796.
I'd like to interrupt you just so that we can get some idea of what the nature of the tradition of
Yes.
the liturgical tradition.
Yes.
We have, through your cooperation, a tape that originally was shown on Israel television, I understand, and I'd like to have just a brief portion of that tape shown to give an example of the synagogue tradition of the Bnei Israel, and it will give us some idea, give our audience some idea of what that synagogue tradition is like.
Certainly.
So if we can have that first tape segment shown, I think it will give us some idea.
Certainly.
Shomer Israel, Shemor Sherit Israel, Ve'al Yobat Israel, Ha'omrim Bechol Yom, Shema Israel.
Could you give us some idea, the general character of the liturgical tradition of the Indian Jewish community, and any differences or similarities? How would you compare it to the Ashkenazic or Sephardic tradition?
The liturgical tradition is the tradition which our people got at the time when David Rahabi came, and he chose three persons as the guides and the philosophers of the community and the leaders, the religious leaders of the community. They were the three families of the Shapurkars, Raspurkar and Jhiradkars. And what we adopted was essentially the Sephardic tradition. The Sephardic Siddur was in fact the Siddur which was used. In the earlier times it was something which was, there was no printing in those days. It was copied in manuscript by hand by the Qazis, by the Jhiradkars to which I belong, and the Shapurkars and the Raspurkars. And that is how we went. We had considerable help in the last 200 years from the Cochin Jews, who always maintained a very continuous tradition. And they also had the Sephardic tradition in it. There's very little difference between theirs and the other Sephardic tradition. There were certain differences, for instance, in the way that we conducted our wedding. The wedding was always conducted by the bridegroom himself. It was he who began the service. It was he who said the particular blessing, saying, "Blessed art thou, Lord our God, who has to permit us to marry lawfully in the particular form," and so on. A blessing which is in other communities said by the minister. It was always said by him. And until he finished up putting the ring on the bride's finger. We at that time, following perhaps also the Cochin tradition, did not have early days the breaking of the glass of wine. But ultimately later on, about 100 years ago, we also began to adopt that tradition. But apart from a few changes here and there, we followed essentially the Sephardic Siddur. There might have been differences perhaps in the form in which we did, in the food at which we ate. But apart from that, I couldn't think of any real change. We insisted, at least I know our forefathers insisted, that we had to be guided by the halacha. We had difficulties because we had no rabbis, but the work of the rabbis was performed by the qazis when they were there.
That was the next really question.
Yes.
Halakha is something I think that people from my community can readily relate to. And how does your tradition relate to the halakha that we know of?
Well, we had to accept it, that we have to be guided by the halakha. And more so because we always said, although and there we didn't have rabbis. We felt that Judaism cannot fail for the want of a rabbi. It had to be continued. After all, for a minyan, it wasn't a rabbi who counted more than one person. There had to be 10 Jews and 10 men that constituted the minyan. And so it was. We tried our best. We often wished and hoped that we really had rabbis. In fact, Chaim Samuel Keimka, who wrote the history of the Jews of India about 100 years ago, at the turn of the last century, he himself noted that how much it was desirable to have a rabbi. But as I said, although we did not have the rabbis, we continued the tradition very strictly, sometimes too strictly perhaps. For instance, in the matter of conversion, being not certain as to how these conversions could take place if a Jew married out, we would not permit the progeny of that union ever to participate in the Jewish affairs, in Jewish synagogues. It was perhaps a very harsh decision at the time, but that was the only way that we thought we could maintain the purity of the religion.
What is the relationship, as an example, between your community now and the normative institutions in Judaism?
Well, see, so far when we were in India, there was no problem at all. We had sometimes a little problem with the Jews, the Baghdadian Jews that come in, who came in about 200 years ago. But even that was not much, because we had many occasions when Baghdadian girls married Ben Israel men, so it was not unusual. However, when our people went to Israel after Israel was formed, the rabbinate there at one time began to take a very close view as to whether we had performed our marriages and divorces in the way that they were performed elsewhere. As to marriage, there could not be any question. That generally it was a question as to divorce. But what they failed to notice was that we didn't have any divorces to speak of. Following the Hindu tradition, for a long time we didn't have any divorces. And if we did, it might be sort of one divorce in about 10 years or 15 years. So it was not a real problem to speak about. However, before that, while the Baghdadian Jews were in Bombay, and they had raised these matters with the rabbis in Safad, they had already received responses to say that no, the Bnei Israel are people who belong to our community and they must be treated well. And in Israel itself, in 1961, the rabbi set up, or the chief rabbi set up a committee of about 11 important rabbis who went to all the halacha, into the sponsor of various luminaries, who came to the conclusion that the Bnei Israel, from their earliest stage, had maintained a contact with the rest of the Jewry.
As you can tell,
Yes.
our time has run out,
Yes.
and I wish we had more time, because there's so much more ground that we have to cover. But I must say that we are really delighted to have you here as our guest for the program, and I think that what you really have done is whetted the appetite of our audience to learn more about your community and your tradition, and to see you in the historical context as a part of the Jewish community in a very warm and friendly way. And we thank you very much for coming and sharing your tradition with us.
Thank you very much, Jack. Cool.
We would like to thank our guest for joining us for this program. We hope you will tune in for our next program in the series, Judaism Today. Judaism Today is brought to you by the New Jersey region of the United Synagogue of America. We welcome your comments and suggestions, and we invite you to write to us at the United Synagogue of America, Deerfield Road and Academy Terrace, Linden, New Jersey, 07036. That's the United Synagogue of America, Deerfield Road and Academy Terrace, Linden, New Jersey, 07036. Judaism Today. We have a program this evening which we think you'll find somewhat interesting because of the subject that we're bringing to you is a visit that some people have made to a place that in a sense is probably difficult to even comprehend, but I think that when you hear some of their experiences you'll be able to appreciate the importance and the real interesting nature of their visit. Our guests are from the Jewish Federation of Central New Jersey, and we have three people. Elaine Ravitch, who is the Vice President of the Federation of Central New Jersey, Nancy Kislin, who is a Women's Division Associate with the Federation, and Frida Poznak, who is the President of the Women's Division, also of the Jewish Federation of Central New Jersey. One of the questions that I have to ask is a visit to Morocco. How does a Jewish person in these days have the nerve to try to visit a place like Morocco? After all, Morocco is an Arab country, a Muslim country. Is it possible? Elaine, how do we begin?
Well, last fall, my husband and one of my sons and myself decided to visit this strange and beautiful land of Morocco, where we knew there was a very, very important Jewish community. We knew that because at times we had been in Israel, and the Jewish Federation's sister city, Kadima, has a very large Moroccan Jewish community. And that was one of the reasons we went.
Now, the two of you went on a different visit. You were part of a mission, UJA mission to Morocco, but really the question, is it possible to go, for a Jewish person to go as a tourist or on a mission to an Arab country? I would imagine most people would find that difficult to believe.
Well, Nancy and I were part of a national women's UJA mission, which encompassed 80 women, only women from across the United States, and we went as a group to see what our funds and dollars that we help raise in the United States, how they are spent in other countries outside of Israel and our own community here in America.
So this is like 2 busloads?
2 full buses of women.
But again, this question of, is it possible for a group of Jews to go to an Arab country as visitors? Is it possible?
Yes, it's possible. It's very important that the Jewish community of America go to Morocco and to see that there is a Jewish community there, alive and living Jewish lives. And it is there are sisters and our brothers.
What was the kind of reception that the officials gave you when you first got there?